In the next few minutes, we're going to run one of the most argued about money decisions there is, all the way through, start to finish, with real numbers instead of guesses. $200,000. One path puts it into a rental property. The other puts it into a broad stock market index fund. We're going to follow both of them, year by year for 15 years, and see exactly what that money turns into in each case, including the parts most videos on this topic conveniently leave out. That means the leverage that makes real estate so powerful, and the risk that comes attached to it. The vacancies, repairs, and closing costs that never show up in the shiny spreadsheets online. The tax advantages almost nobody explains properly, and what 2026's mortgage rates and market conditions actually mean if you were starting this decision today instead of 15 years ago. By the end, you'll have an honest, side-by-side scorecard and a real answer to which $200,000 decision actually built more wealth. And why. Before we get into it, a quick note. This video is for educational purposes only. It walks through a hypothetical scenario using historical averages and reasonable assumptions to illustrate how these two paths tend to behave. It isn't personalized financial, tax, or investment advice, and real results will vary based on your market, your financing, and your own decisions. Always talk to a licensed financial advisor or tax professional before making a decision this size. All right, let's get into the numbers. Two people, two friends, the same starting number, $200,000. One of them buys a house, the other one buys the market. 15 years later, they sit down, open their laptops, and compare numbers. And what they find isn't close. It isn't a small gap. It's the kind of gap that makes one of them wish they'd made a different call 15 years earlier. But here's the thing. Most people watching this already have a guess about who wins. And that guess is probably wrong. Not because real estate is bad, and not because index funds are magic. It's wrong because almost nobody runs the real math. They run the story in their head. The story where rent checks arrive every month like clockwork, where the house pays for itself, where property values only go up. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what $200,000 turns into after 15 years, in both paths, including the parts nobody puts in the thumbnail. Let's set the scene. Investor A takes the $200,000 and puts it into a broad index fund, something that tracks the entire stock market. No stock picking, no timing, no drama. Just buy, hold, and let compounding do the work. Investor B takes the same $200,000 and uses it as a 25% down payment on an $800,000 rental property, financing the remaining $600,000 with a mortgage. And right there is the whole reason this comparison gets misunderstood. Investor A is risking $200,000. Investor B is controlling $800,000 of assets. Same starting cash, completely different exposure. Follow Investor A first because this path is simpler, and that's exactly its appeal. Historically, a broad stock index has returned somewhere around 8 to 10% a year on average over long stretches. Not every year. Some years it's up 20%. Some years it drops 30%. In 2008 alone, the market fell nearly 40% in a single year, and anyone who panicked and sold near the bottom locked in that loss permanently. But smoothed out over 15 years of holding and not touching it, that 8 to 10% range is what people plan around. Growing at a steady 9% with no withdrawals, $200,000 crosses $300,000 by year 5, brushes past $470,000 by year 10, and lands around $720,000 by year 15. No tenants, no midnight phone calls about a broken water heater, no repainting a bedroom between renters. And critically, it's liquid. The money can be pulled out in a weekend if life happens, a job loss, a medical bill, an emergency. It's also one of the best tools available for staying diversified, since that $200,000 is spread across hundreds of companies instead of riding on one address in one neighborhood. Now, Investor B's path. Remember, $200,000 didn't buy an $800,000 house. It bought control over one. The bank supplied the other $600,000. This is leverage, and it's the single biggest reason real estate returns can outrun stock returns on paper, and also the single biggest reason real estate can go badly wrong. Real estate makes money 4 separate ways, stacked on top of each other. Rental income first. After the mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, there's usually $300 or $400 a month left over if the property is managed well. Investors often call this the cash-on-cash return, since it measures the cash coming back relative to the cash actually put down. Second, mortgage paydown. Every month, part of that rent payment reduces the loan balance, meaning the tenant is effectively buying the house for the owner, one payment at a time. Third, appreciation. If the property gains a modest 3 to 4% a year, that growth applies to the full $800,000 asset, not just the $200,000 down payment. Fourth, tax benefits, which turn out to be bigger than most people assume. Stack all 4 together, and Investor B's $200,000 can be working far harder than Investor A's on paper. That's the case for real estate. That's why the thumbnail says not even close. But leverage isn't free money. It's a multiplier. It multiplies gains, and it multiplies losses, vacancies, and stress just as easily. Here's the part almost every rental property spreadsheet online quietly skips. Open any online return calculator, and you'll see a spreadsheet full of green cells. Green for profit, green for positive, green for this is working. But those calculators almost always assume a perfect landlord experience. Full occupancy, on-time rent, no damage, no expensive surprises, appreciation that never has a down year. Reality is noisier. A property sits empty for 2 months between tenants. That's 2 months of mortgage payments with 0 rent coming in. A water heater fails. A roof needs replacing in year 11. A tenant stops paying and it takes months and a lawyer to resolve. A fair comparison has to build in vacancy, usually 5 to 8% of the year, even in a good market. Maintenance, around 1% of the property's value annually. And property management fees, around 8 to 10% of collected rent if the owner isn't doing the work personally. Run the real numbers instead of the green cell version, and the rental's return doesn't disappear, but it gets a lot more honest. Put both paths on the same timeline with realistic assumptions, and here's how they move. Year 1. Investor A's $200,000 ticks up to around $218,000. Investor B, after vacancy, repairs, and closing costs, is roughly breaking even on cash flow, but has already gained around $30,000 in combined appreciation and mortgage paydown on the underlying asset. Year 5, Investor A is around $308,000. Investor B's mortgage balance has dropped by roughly $60,000 through paydown alone. The property has likely appreciated to around $900,000. And accumulated cash flow puts Investor B's total equity in a similar range. The 2 paths are surprisingly close at this point. Year 10, they start to separate. Investor A has grown to roughly $470,000. Investor B's mortgage balance is down to around $350,000. The property is likely worth over $1 million, and Investor B's total equity is pulling ahead purely because leverage has had a full decade to compound on a much larger asset base. Year 15, Investor A's portfolio lands around $720,000. Investor B's property, if nothing catastrophic happened along the way, is worth somewhere around $1.25 million, with a mortgage balance shrunk to roughly $200,000, meaning equity of over $1 million, plus 15 years of accumulated cash flow on top. That's the not even close moment from the thumbnail. But it only happens because leverage compounded uninterrupted for 15 straight years, with no forced sale during a downturn and no major repair that drained the reserves. There's a piece of this puzzle that rarely comes up but has a real measurable effect: depreciation. The tax code allows a rental owner to deduct a portion of the building's value every year, as if it's wearing out, even while it's actually gaining value in the real world. On an $800,000 property, that deduction can shelter a meaningful chunk of rental income from taxes, sometimes enough to make the property show a loss on paper while it's cash flow positive in reality. Add mortgage interest deductions, and in some cases the ability to defer taxes entirely by rolling one property into another through what's called a 1031 exchange, and the after-tax gap widens further in the rental's favor. For investors who qualify for real estate professional status and materially participate in managing their properties, that advantage grows even larger. Index funds don't get this treatment. Dividends are taxed the year they're received, and capital gains are taxed on sale. There's also a scaling advantage real estate offers that stocks generally don't. Once enough equity builds up, an investor can do a cash-out refinance, pulling money out of the property tax-free, since it's a loan and not a sale, and use that cash as a down payment on a second property. This is how many real estate investors turn one rental into 3 or 4 over 15 years. Margin lending exists for stock investors too, but it's far riskier, since a market drop can trigger a forced margin call within days, something a fixed-rate mortgage never does. Now, the part that separates a useful analysis from a sales pitch. Leverage cuts both ways. If that $800,000 property had dropped just 15% in value, which has happened in real downturns, Investor B wouldn't be down 15%. Because the down payment was only $200,000 against an $800,000 asset, a 15% drop wipes out 60% of the original equity. That's the multiplier working in reverse. There's illiquidity. Investor A can sell shares on a Tuesday afternoon and have cash within days. Investor B, needing emergency cash, is looking at months. Listing the property, negotiating, closing, paying an agent's commission that can run 5 to 6% of the sale price. There's time and stress that never show up in a spreadsheet: screening tenants, answering midnight calls about burst pipes, chasing late rent, and dealing with a bad tenant who has to be legally evicted, sometimes a months-long, $1,000 process. And there's concentration risk. Investor A's money is spread across hundreds of companies. Investor B's leveraged position rides on a single property, in a single neighborhood, subject to one local job market and one city council's decisions. On the flip side, real estate does offer one genuine advantage during inflationary periods that's worth naming. Rents and property values tend to rise alongside inflation, while a fixed-rate mortgage payment stays exactly the same for 30 years, meaning inflation quietly makes the debt cheaper to repay every year that passes. There's one more cost most people forget to price in on the rental side before they ever collect their first rent check: getting into the deal at all. Closing costs on an $800,000 property typically run 2 to 5% of the purchase price, meaning somewhere between $16,000 and $40,000 before a single tenant moves in. Add homeowners insurance, which has climbed sharply in many states over the past few years due to rising repair costs and, in some regions, wildfire and flood risk, plus HOA fees if the property has them. And Investor B's true starting position is a little smaller than the clean $200,000 number suggests. None of this erases the leverage advantage, it just means the real starting line sits a few steps behind the spreadsheet version. It's worth grounding all of this in something closer to a real story instead of just formulas. Plenty of everyday investors who bought a single rental property with a similar down payment in the early 2000s and simply held on. Riding out a slow first few years, a rocky 2020, and mortgage rates that later became historically cheap to refinance into ended up sitting on properties worth 2 to 3 times their purchase price by year 15, not because they did anything clever, but because they didn't panic sell during the rough years and let leverage and time do the compounding. The index fund investors who did the same thing, buying once and simply not touching the account through the 2018 dip, the 2020 crash, and the 2022 downturn, tell an almost identical story. The single biggest driver of the final number in either path usually isn't which asset was chosen. It's whether the investor survived the uncomfortable years without selling. This comparison also looks different depending on when you actually start it. In 2026, mortgage rates have mostly sat in the 6 to 6.5% range, a long way from the 3% mortgages that fueled the real estate boom of the early 2020s. And that single change directly affects how much cash flow a new rental can generate the moment it's purchased. At the same time, some analysts are forecasting below-average stock returns over the next few years compared to the long-term historical average, a reminder that 9% is a long-run average, not a promise. Real estate investor sentiment has cooled compared to a year earlier, as higher borrowing costs make the math tighter for new buyers, and home price growth nationally has slowed to a crawl compared to a few years ago, meaning a buyer starting today shouldn't assume the same appreciation rate used in this 15-year model. The investor who bought in 2011 had a very different 15 years ahead of them than the investor buying today. So which one actually wins? The honest answer is, it depends what you're solving for. If the goal is the single largest number after 15 years, and there's the temperament and the timeline to ride out vacancies, repairs, and a possible downturn without needing to sell, leverage in real estate has historically had the edge, and the math here shows exactly why, landing over $1 million in equity versus $720,000. But if the goal is simplicity, liquidity, and the lowest stress per dollar earned, the index fund path delivered $720,000 for doing essentially nothing. And here's the detail almost nobody mentions. These two paths aren't mutually exclusive. Plenty of investors who've built real wealth over 15-plus years didn't pick one side. They used index funds to build a liquid safety net and used real estate, when the numbers and the timing made sense, to add leverage on top. The real skill was never choosing a side. It's understanding exactly what's being traded, liquidity for leverage, simplicity for control, before committing $200,000 to either one. $200,000, 15 years, two completely different journeys, one quiet and liquid, one leveraged and hands-on. The number that wins by year 15 depends less on which asset class is better, and far more on the interest rate borrowed at, the market bought into, how well the risk was managed along the way, and whether the investor could survive the years when the spreadsheet wasn't green. If this breakdown gave you a clearer, more honest picture of what $200,000 can actually turn into, do 3 quick things before you go. Hit like so this kind of deep, numbers-first breakdown reaches more people instead of another surface-level take. Share it with the one friend who's currently stuck deciding between buying a rental or just dumping their savings into the market. This is exactly the conversation they need to see. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe now, because next week we're running this same 15-year scorecard again, this time with a completely different starting number, and the result might surprise you even more than this one did.